our speakers are going to be providing us with much more thought on Palestine as a feminist, anti-racist and environmental issue, and I'm going to introduce them now and then pass over to them. So first we've got Shanice Octavia McBean, who's a black feminist and Afro-Marxist organiser. She's the co-author of Abolition Revolution, which is an award-nominated book on race, class and policing in the UK, and she's been active in the trade union movement, as well as Sisters Uncut and Black Jewish Alliance. We've also got Joshua Virasami, who's an activist, writer and artist. He's currently head of organising and education at London Renters Union, and he was an organiser with the Occupy movement and has been involved in anti-racist and climate justice groups, including London Black Reps, Dissidents, Black Lives Matter UK, and Wretched of the Earth. He's the author of How to Change It, and has a forthcoming edited collection called The World Without Racism, which will be released this year. Let's hear it. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we've got Hamza Hamouchene, who's an Algerian researcher and activist. He's the co-founder of Environmental Justice North Africa and the Siyada Network for Food Sovereignty in the Arab region, and he's currently the Arab Region Program Coordinator at the Transnational Institute. Amazing. So we will hear from each speaker for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for some questions and comments, and we'll also allow for a bit of discussion between yourselves as well. Shanice, are you up for kicking us off?
No. Joking. Thank you so much, Nads. So I'm going to be talking about the connections between the struggle for Palestinian liberation and feminism. And I'm going to kind of take us through a kind of analytical perspective on why these struggles are connected, and then at the end kind of go through some practical things that we might do to further bring these movements and struggles together. So I want to start by drawing out the fact that there is a long-standing tension in the feminist movement between what I will call feminisms of the status quo and what you might call feminisms from below. So working class feminisms, black feminisms, global south feminisms. And this is elucidated in this country, for example, between the feminism of, say, Emmeline Pankhurst, which can be summarised as votes for women, but only some women, rich white women in specific. Don't bother giving votes to those pesky working class men, they're irrelevant. Oh, and of course, in the context of during a war, we don't need votes for women in that context. We need to, focus on our imperial and colonial ventures and protecting empire around the world. And that was contrasted to the universal suffrage approach of Sylvia Pankhurst, who was an anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist feminist organiser for suffrage in the East End. And so there has always been these, what you can generally describe as two strands, a status quo and a from below tension within feminism. We can look as well to, for example, the plight of Sojourner Truth, a black woman who was enslaved in the American colonies, who turned to white women struggling against the frilled shackles of white patriarchy, and she asked the question, ain't I a woman? And we know the names of many black, Muslim and global south feminists who have asked of white status quo feminisms, aren't we women too? Don't our lives, don't our issues, don't our struggles matter too? So in this context, it was no surprise when self-described feminist Hadley Freeman wrote an opinion piece in the Jewish Chronicle questioning why UK-based feminist direct action group Sisters Uncut care enough about what's happening in Gaza to organise direct actions in train stations. She asked, why would British feminists care about Palestinians? And Sisters Uncut asked, aren't Palestinian women too? So I want to talk through why should British feminists care about Gaza? Why should British feminists care about Palestinian liberation more generally? And I want to make 3 arguments for why we should care as feminists that take us through 3 geopolitical locations. First, Palestine itself, then the concept of the West, and then I'm going to take us to the UK. So, since the Balfour Declaration in the early 1900s, there have always been women resisting Israeli colonial violence and later Israeli occupation, so that's not new. And we know from our own experiences of state and military violence that violence isn't bordered by the 4 walls of a home, but make their way into the private sphere. So violence from the streets, violence from the state, military violence, occupational violence, somehow always finds its way also to become violence within the home. So, for example, in the UK, there is a really clear link between domestic violence in the home and youth and police violence on the streets. That's a very well-documented link and connection. And women in Palestine today find themselves up against a similar duality of oppressions where the conditions of colonial violence buttress a system of patriarchal violence. So, for example, the lack of free movement enforced by the coloniser, the inability to get away from violence in the home, the inability to live a flourishing, economically self-sufficient life, because if you try to leave, you can't, and if you try to get to work through checkpoints, often you can't. Small and cramped living conditions in densely populated areas, which provide no privacy or route out of isolation or space away from potential domestic violence, where refugees are, cramped in ever densely populated areas, places, buildings, to the complete lack of privacy that then creates, to the constant dehumanization of men and women, and that experience of complete lack of control, complete lack and sense of personhood that then seeps its way into the home as a form of violence against women. And that's obviously an experience that not only of Palestinian men, but also of Palestinian women. To having to raise deeply traumatized children and the impact that would have on a mother. And also having to fight against antiquated or non-existent or anti-women laws that date back to the early occupation of Palestine, which make women especially vulnerable to domestic violence and femicide, as there is no accountability and there are no routes to accountability. And there is an inability to escape, as there is an ability to escape colonial violence. So that's an example of the general situation for women in Palestine, but also in acute crises such as in Gaza today, this will be amplified many, many times with additional horrors that women have to face. So we know that in Gaza today there are around 50,000 women who are pregnant, and there are around 180 births taking place a day. Births taking place with no anaesthetic, no medication, no hospital equipment, often on the floors of hospitals, even if they even are taking place on the floors of hospitals. Women who are malnourished, who are unable to produce adequate breast milk because there's little food, little water, and so mothers and babies are starving. And then, of course, even if you do give birth on a hospital floor, there is no home to go back to, there is only tents. To even the daily struggle of having no support for postnatal depression, no support for PTSD. In this sense, Israel has in Gaza today destroyed the ability for Palestinians to reproduce themselves socially, not just now economically. And that is a direct attack on women and children. They have made the conditions of life impossible, not just the conditions of living, but the conditions of life-making. And that, again, is a direct attack on women, women's social reproductive abilities and women's biologically reproductive capabilities. So this is, of course, partly what makes the situation in Gaza today a genocide, but it's also what makes it an urgent feminist issue. The very logic of a genocidal colonial regime requires the brutal oppression of women and their ability to create, make, and sustain life, and makes these conditions of life irreconcilably and horrifically dangerous. And so this is reflected in the fact that women and children have been disproportionately murdered in the onslaught. And by the way, that's not to say more men should be murdered. Absolutely not. No Palestinians should be murdered. But this patriarchal logic of colonial violence is reflected in the disproportionate murders of women and children. So now I want to kind of take the argument to the West and the role of white feminists, white Western status quo feminisms, and the image of the pure Western woman as a tool of war propaganda. And so, you know, the same civilizing missions of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, where the West were invading supposedly to save women from brutal Arab Muslim men, is playing out also today. Specifically around accusations and trigger warning here of mass rape and mass sexual violence being used as the pretext for genocide. And I just want to be clear on this point, because I do think it's important to state a few points of principle, which is that accusations of sexual violence must always, regardless of the circumstances, be taken seriously. And always, we must never slip into automatic disbelief for any reason, however. And additionally, we also do not need to be defensive about the need for and the justness of Palestinian liberation. Palestinian liberation is not dependent on Palestinians being perfect or good people, just as the mass protests of millions for George Floyd did not need to be defensive about the fact that he had beat up a pregnant woman. We do not need to be defensive ever about Palestinian liberation. Palestinian liberation is always just regardless. However, we must always reject narratives that rely on racist assumptions of the unique patriarchal violence in Arab and Muslim men. Patriarchal violence is not unique to Arab and Muslim men, it is a universal form of violence. So as quoted earlier, around 1 woman a week, I haven't quoted earlier, as I'm quoting now, around one woman a week is murdered in Palestine, but I want to contrast that by a partner or an ex-partner, which is horrific. But I want to contrast that to the fact that that figure is 2 women a week in the UK. So, you know, patriarchal violence is a global, not a Eastern issue. So in the context of the genocide, we have to be clear about what's happening, that the image of Western women, in this case Israeli women, are being used as a pretext for genocide, and we must reject feminisms that use the image of the pure woman to buttress colonial and imperial violence. And instead we must make the principled point that all accusations of any sexual violence must be investigated and taken seriously, but that it is in fact Israel, in the case of what happened on the 7th of October, who's preventing the facts from being established on the ground by destroying evidence, by preventing independent organisations to be able to collect evidence, by rejecting independent journalists being able to access Gaza, and of course by engaging in exaggerations, lies and war propaganda. And I think that is the principled position. So finally, let's bring the argument to the UK. Feminism in the UK has suffered, I would say, a major decline. There are, individuals and individual groups who are holding up the torch of kind of radical feminism, but more broadly, the movement doesn't look like how it looked, say, 10 years ago when I was on campuses. And I think this coincides largely with the defeats of left-wing and social movements more generally. But as we always say, as you know, our socialist ilk always say, an uptick in struggle, during an uptick in struggle, there's always opportunities for us to broaden our appeal and rebuild our movement infrastructure, and I think feminism is no different in that regard. So there are opportunities, I believe, to connect the plight of women in the UK to women in Palestine and Palestinians more generally. I mentioned earlier that 2 women a week are killed at the hands of a partner or ex-partner in the UK. And while it's absolutely true that the suffocation of occupation is nothing like conditions in the UK, and the suffocation of genocidal violence is nothing like conditions in the UK, and the suffocation of settler colonialism is nothing like conditions in the UK, it is still the case that conditions in the UK do make it hard for women to leave, and sometimes impossible for women to leave violent relationships. The lack of social housing, the decimation of support services, the rise in isolation and mental ill health, the slashing of benefits and the ability for working class women to have economic freedom. All of these are not the same as the situation in Palestine, but mirror the situation in Palestine, and therefore provide us with opportunities for connection across imperial and nation-state boundaries. So what can we do? I think personally, events like this are absolutely essential. Political education is essential. It is mandatory. You've got to all do your essential e-learning. Analysis is urgent, and ideas are vital. And I think we need to be doing more to be making these links. So, for example, why is the UK government funding Israeli genocide and is defunding women's services? Why are we funding genocide and defunding women's safety? These are the sorts of messages that we could be using to broaden our appeal as feminists and broaden and revitalise our movements. Use your analysis, use your ideas, use your knowledge to pressure people that supposedly care about women, that's in feminist groups and self-described feminists. And use these feminist talking points in your direct actions, in your events, in your trade unions. Start making this a broader issue at the level of ideas and moving also then into the level of action. So those are just some points, some ideas that I thought I'd bring to the floor, and I'd really like to hear people's reflections and other ways we could be making these links and connecting these struggles. Thank you.
Everybody, I want to thank Workers in Palestine for organising this day school. As Shanice said, we all need to be kind of constantly thinking through what's happening right now, as well as taking action. I mean, we used to do things like this way more often, and I feel like this is supposed to be a model, not a one-off. We need to do more things like this. I've only got 10 to 15 minutes, so I'm going to dive straight into it, and I'm going to follow a similar track to Shanice, actually. So, the provocation for me is like, what does a popular anti-racism from below look like? What is it saying? What is it doing? What is it thinking? And I thought maybe I should double back a second and be like, what is a popular anti-racism from below? So I think it bears pausing to ask ourselves what that is. And even at a simple level, racialization and race and racism are an organising principle in how the nation state manages the working class, how the settler colonial state manages the colonised. The national project invokes itself, the nation invokes itself through race, ethnicity, and religion. It's how surplus populations are created, how they're differentiated, how they're hyper-exploited, and how they're expelled. It transforms class antagonisms into white resentments. It collectively punishes at the border and then dispenses that border through society. And I say this to say that racism is ubiquitous. It is everywhere shaping the patterns of capitalist development. And popular anti-racism, therefore, it means an anti-racism that must supply an organising principle in the converse. It is an organising principle in how anti-capitalist struggle takes place writ large. So popular anti-racism means our movements, workers' movements, climate movements, feminist movements, all of them must be jointly producing a popular racism and a popular anti-imperialism. So I'm going to go through like a few points about like what this kind of popular anti-racism might look like or sound like. I think it is fighting anti-racism from above. So it kind of goes without saying that if ours is from below, it's in direct contestation with one from above. There are a very active assortment of characters in Britain, from lawyers to journalists, regulatory bodies to think tanks, that are working to ensure that the resurgence of anti-racism into public space is decoupled from Palestine solidarity. And we must organise ourselves to do the opposite. So I'm going to talk about the BLM moment for a second. So in the summer of 2020, museums, galleries, corporations, foundations, it's an unending list, political parties, universities, everyone flocked to express a desire to be anti-racist. As the newest wave of BLM protests rocked the world, right? They were huge. Black squares, long statements, EDI positions, some of them really well paid, by the way, like £200,000 to be an equity diversity consultant. Sometimes I think I did the wrong thing. This time they meant it, right? In theory, they're responding to the demands, to the pressure from young, multiracial, working class mass protests. All of them wanted to be anti-racist. But then a year later, in spring 2021, when the real anti-racist litmus test arrived, as the very same youth poured into the streets, they were silent. In May 2021, the illegal Israeli eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah led to resistance, led to repression, led to further resistance, and eventually the death of over 256 Palestinians and 13 Israelis. Tens of thousands of young people poured into the street and took action, right? They did it through online propaganda, they did it physically in their schools, which was a most a beautiful and profound thing to see. And they were in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. At exactly the same time as George Floyd was murdered by the US State Police, a US-Israeli proposed plan to illegally further annex the Palestinian West Bank was deployed. And BLM UK, an organisation I'm part of, posted online against this action. And the repercussions for us were immense, and this is what I mean about this wanting to decouple. Suddenly, the entire Black Lives Matter movement had fallen into disrepute. The Football Association were backtracking, the BBC were backtracking, government ministers were in Parliament name-dropping BLM UK as a Marxist organisation. You know, we're a bit of a Marxist organisation. It's a bit true. And a host of Israeli-backed NGOs and charities and media outlets were on the attack, and they were using the Palestinian solidarity is a similar thing to what Shanice was talking about, as a stick to beat the movements at the spearhead of the BLM movement. And I just want to say it is impossible to de-link Black Lives Matter from Palestinian freedom. It is a long, powerful tradition, black radical tradition, which sees liberation of the racialized poor in the West as interdependent with anti-colonial struggle in the global South. Anti-racism anti-imperialism are inseparable. And it is incumbent upon us to therefore harass every organisation which raised the Black Lives Matter banner, which said, colonialism and racism have no place in today's world. And there was loads of organisations that were doing that. I mean, I went to the Natural History Museum to talk about decolonising stuff. I mean, you know, the decolonising stuff, question mark, is a bit weird. But they're now silent on the colonial genocide of Palestinians. And we have to say that there's double standards. And we have to talk about what it means to embrace an anti-racism which counts for something. To the many people and organisations, somewhere between our anti-racism from below and the anti-racism from above, we must guide them. We must teach them and show them that there is no such thing as a selective anti-racism. You cannot oppose the oppression of black people and stand idly by when anti-Semitism takes grip in Europe. You cannot decry the violence of apartheid and colonialism in South Africa and turn a blind eye to Israeli settler colonialism. And I'll give a short example of this. So last year, as Nad said, we're working on a collection called A World About Racism. And we wanted to fund all of the different groups, 10 different organizations to kind of write and research and take some time to think about anti-racism. And last year, well before this was a public project, it got attacked. And it got attacked by UK Lawyers for Israel, working in tandem with the Jewish Chronicle, tipping off the Charity Commission as a regulatory body to try and shut down that project. They drew a wedge through the foundation, the funder. I'm going to try to speak about them in not too, they were pagans about it. They said, how could you fund a violent extremist who, they brought up a tweet where I said, up the Intifada. And I'll talk about this at a specific point where, a specific point of what they tried to take down. So they wobbled big time. This is a big foundation that funds a lot of the work that the movement does. It has a third of $1 billion in its endowment. And they wobbled. They said, we don't know if we can do this, is he racist? Are we racist? And they went for the Board of Trustees. It's a very common attack, this lawfare, you know, they use the lawyers to attack the Board of Trustees, and there's really good work to undermine this. But instead of like, you know, I wanted to run in there and start knocking heads on tables and stuff like that, but instead of doing that, we were like, how can we take these guys on a journey? And some of the people in this room and others really spent time working with them, bringing in people, some people in this room, to educate them. And you know, on the other side of it, they now have a position. They're now actually educating. They're doing, you know, they're doing better. And that's an important part of what we mean when we're trying to catch people who are caught between the ones from above and the one from below. So the second thing I'll say is like, anti-racism from below is about building the confidence within the masses to critique a single picture of global violence. And I'll explain that a bit. So to some it might feel kind of counterintuitive to this urgent sense of needing to like, you know, hoist up the battering rams and smash the economic interests of Israel. And we are doing that and we are taking action. But we actually also need to always ramp up political education. Without, as we heard in the first panel, without a steadfast anti-racist politics of liberation, without a materialist analysis of the forces at play, we risk failing the Palestinian struggle for freedom by evacuating that space. And when you evacuate that space, the only thing that fills it is bourgeois politics of human rights and other bullshit like that. So, as I said, in BLM UK, we have come under heat from the ruling class the most, you know, being brought up by conservative frontbenchers, being deemed unwholesome anti-racists. You know, who are the wholesome anti-racists, I want to know. Because we spoke about the inability to critique Israel publicly through the chill of the IHRA adoptions. So what I really just want to reiterate, these kinds of things, these day schools, these sessions, we're hungry for them, we need them. It's not a one-off, it's a model. So what do we mean when we say when I say global violence or a picture of global violence? The Latin suffix "sedo," I don't know how to speak Latin. "Sedo," often shortened as "side," denotes the act of killing. The act of killing is what undergirds capitalist modernity. So femicide, ecocide, genocide, these are different sides of the same shape. As this panel demonstrates, and as today's sessions no doubt explore, there are shadows of exploitation, expropriation, and expulsion absolutely everywhere. Patrick Wolfe famously remarked, he's a really great settler colonial scholar from Australia, he remarked that colonialism is a structure, not an event. This means that it endures with time, it solidifies across it. And we're then left with the question of that structure, right? Like, how is it scaffolded? What is that structure based on? And race, for centuries, has supplied the foundations of that structure. It mediates the encounter, as I said before, between the colonizer and the colonized. It manages, at times expels the colonized, christening them as the wretched of the earth. And I'm going to bring back a bit to like how this connects with what's going on here in the UK. James Baldwin, great guy, once said, Israel was created for the salvation of Western interests. We can only confirm it has remained protected, armored, shielded as such. In the late 80s, Biden, US president now, would say, US hegemony is impossible without Israel. If Israel didn't exist, he said, we'd have to make a new Israel. Israel itself, then, is the enduring structure of settler colonialism. Baldwin, an astute critic of Zionism, would later write a dispatch from the hood. He went to Brooklyn and studied police violence. He called it a dispatch from occupied territory. He is, of course, choosing his words very carefully. He's suggesting that policing in the ends is experienced through the modality of race, and it is, in so doing, recreating the encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. In fact, many here, including Shanice in her brilliant book, have explained how policing here is in fact boomeranging practices from the colonial encounter back to the British working class through policing. But that structural feeling is even bigger, right? These police manage racialized populations where, whilst their sink estates, so-called sink estates, are sold off in a process best described as domicide, the killing of home. A catastrophe, David Madden, a great geographer about housing, suggests, with the same genetics as what's happening in Palestine. And it's no wonder for me, like when I was walking through the Graham Park estate, which is a really big estate in northwest London in Colindale, and it's home to the amazing group Forefront Project. Big up Forefront Project. It's no surprise when I was walking through there with people and they were talking to me about the ends and what's going on, and they were explaining that the boarded up homes are part of a huge regeneration process, that they pointed to a large block that's scheduled for demolition and said, oh yeah, the young people in this area refer to that as the Gaza. That Israeli capital, Israeli methods of violent policing are here, and these connections are material. And I want to kind of go into this idea of a single picture. And this is connected to the above point. And it's an important task for anti-racists to do, to create this single picture of global violence. Oh, goddamn. I'll start with a quote from Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's a black militant and political prisoner in the USA, an amazing guy. Don't know about him, just check him out. His writings and radio podcasts are incredible. And the quote is, and he's Black Panther, to the average Panther, even though he worked daily in the ghetto communities of North America, his thoughts were usually on something larger than himself. It meant being part of a worldwide movement against US imperialism, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. We felt as if we were part of the peasant armies of Vietnam, the degraded black miners of South Africa, the Fedayeen in Palestine. The Black Panthers used the motif of the pig to create a single picture of imperialist violence, state violence, capitalist exploitation. Bobby Seale called it the racist pig power structure. It's really good. You should check the images that what's the name of the famous artist who did Emory Douglas used to do. The Panthers took Lenin's instruction very seriously, and I think it bears repeating as an instruction to revolutionary anti-racists. Lenin said we must become a tribune of the people who are able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of the people it affects. We must be able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence, capitalist exploitation. A powerful anti-racist movement is able to say in this single picture, yes, when the IDF trains the Met Police, it makes sense that Borden would call his dispatch on police violence from the hood a report from the occupied territory. It makes sense that people on estates up and down the country refer to their ends as the Gaza. That people from the colony within feel a direct affinity to the colonized, that they recognize who they are in the battle of David and Goliath. We need to build on that common cause and politicize it further. Because it is essential, as the Panthers said, and this was on one of their pictures of the pig power structure, quote, when the slave of imperialism, who lives in the house of imperialism, takes up struggle in common cause with those resisting around the world, then the days of the imperialists are numbered.
Hi everybody. It's always great to share the panel and be amongst comrades in support for a just cause. In the last 3 to 4 months, it has become a habit of mine to start all my talks by saying, we cannot talk about environmental and climate justice, about decolonization, about dismantling colonialism, green or otherwise, and turn a blind eye to the genocide that is taking place in Palestine right now, perpetrated by deeply racist settler, colonial, and the apartheid state of Israel, with the deep support, the active support and complicity of Western imperialist powers, from the US to the EU, to the UK, to France, Canada, and Germany. And I think we need to go a step further and be in active support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Decolonization, environmental and climate justice are not just purely rhetorical or abstract words. They must be rooted in material resistance and liberation. Before I share some reflection why I think the Palestinian liberation struggle is also an environmental and climate justice struggle, I wanted to share with you quickly some facts and numbers from the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now, because that would reveal that Israel is not only committing a genocide, but also committing an ecocide of devastating proportions. The first fact, even before the current war, and because of the 17-year imposed siege on Gaza and prior onslaughts that hindered the creation and repair of water installation and desalination plant, 95% of the water from Gaza's sole aquifer was already not fit for consumption. Now the situation is much more worse. We have a total breakdown and destruction of water facilities and infrastructure, resulting in the collapse of drinking water supplies, which lead to dehydration, diseases, and the escalation of the water and health crisis. The second fact, Israel's plans to flood the tunnels in Gaza with seawater have been described by environmental experts as a big risk for causing an ecological catastrophe that would leave Gaza with no drinkable water and devastate what little agriculture is possible and ruin the conditions of life for everyone in Gaza. The third fact, the CO2 emissions generated during the first 2 months of the war were greater than the annual carbon footprint, listen to this, of more than 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. 99% of those emissions are attributable to Israel's aerial bombardment and ground invasions. And half of the total CO2 emissions were down to US carriage planes flying military supplies to Israel, which points to the fact that the US is a full active participant in this genocidal and ecocidal war. And of course, the argument also points to the under-scrutinized role of the military-industrial complex in causing the global climate crisis. The fourth fact, we have an ongoing destruction and pollution, including with the use of phosphorus, of extensive tracts of agricultural land, raising farms, crops, orchards, and greenhouses. So this is basically not a genocide, but also an ecocide, because it basically destroys and eliminates the basic conditions of life. Let's come now to my main arguments regarding what I think the Palestine struggle is also an environmental and climate justice struggle. So there is this colonial environmental narrative, what some people call environmental Orientalism, that has been developed since colonial times, and that originated actually in my home country, Algeria, during French colonial times. So that 19th century Anglo-European imaginary represents the environment in the Arab world more often as alien, exotic, abnormal, and frequently as degraded and defective in need of improvement, restoration, and repair. And of course, in this story, the native and indigenous play the role of the ecological savage that is responsible for the destruction of the environment. The iteration of this colonial and racist and orientalist environmental narrative, in our case here, is Israel has made the desert bloom. However, this is a very deceptive narrative that obfuscates the realities of mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, destruction of environments, plundering of resources, including water, and apartheid. Israel represents itself as an environmental champion while dispossessing and oppressing Palestinians. This narrative must be challenged and deconstructed. The second point is around the direct impacts of Israeli occupation and settler colonialism and its corrosive effects on the water and agricultural infrastructure, which are interlinked because Palestine remains an agrarian country. I'll focus on the water element of that equation. So we have decades and decades of plunder and appropriation of resources in what some Palestinian scholars termed or named water apartheid or water apartheid infrastructures. and that functions through four mechanisms: theft and appropriation of water resources, control of supply through quotas, obstruction of development, including the allowance of wells, the approval of wells, and then the destruction of infrastructure by demolishing those wells and through bombing campaigns. Some statistics that are really important to know. The majority of the water resources in occupied Palestine are controlled by Israel. Only 50% of households in the West Bank have access to water on a daily basis. It's 30% in Gaza, and it's much more worse now. I said 95% of the water resources in Gaza are contaminated, unfit for drinking and irrigation. And we have 600,000 illegal Israeli settlers using 6 times more water than the entire 3 million Palestinian population of the West Bank, which make the water per capita availability of Palestinians one of the lowest in the world. The third point is the argument around sacrifice zones. Israel is making the occupied Palestinian territories as its sacrifice zones by dumping waste, building landfills, polluting factories near the Green Lane, and also in the occupied West Bank. And also there are practices of crop dusting, basically polluting the land and agriculture. And this is not just about externalizing socio-environmental costs to the peripheries by the centers of imperialism, but also goes hand in hand with the ethnic cleansing efforts of Israel and its broader settler colonial projects rooted in a deeply racist, ethno-religious Zionist supremacy ideology that is bent on eliminating Palestinians and forcing them to leave. My fourth argument is around the climate crisis, the escalating climate crisis that we are seeing globally right now. It is global, but it will be affecting people and countries differently and evenly across various lines: class, gender, race, urban, rural, north, south, but also between colonizers and colonized. The East Mediterranean regions will be one of the most impacted regions of the climate crisis. In terms of the decrease of precipitation and rainfall levels, but also in terms of the increase in temperature levels, which really exacerbate the existing manufactured water crisis. So we have the fact that even Israelis and Palestinians are inhabiting the same physical terrain. The impacts will be asymmetrical, very asymmetrical. Palestinians will be much more impacted for various reasons. So this vulnerability that we are talking about to climate change, Palestinian vulnerability to climate change, is the result, primarily the result of 100 years of colonialism, occupation, apartheid, dispossession, and displacement. Basically, the climate crisis will be amplifying the existing injustices, inequalities, dependencies, and also relations of dominations. While Israel is one of the least vulnerable countries and more ready or readiest to tackle the climate crisis in the region, we need to ask why. First of all, because it stole and appropriated Palestinian resources and also developed technologies to tackle that climate crisis with the help of the centers of empire and with Palestinian labor, while denying those technologies and resources to Palestinians. Basically, the ability to adapt to climate change in Palestine and Israel is very much differentiated according to race, religion, legal status, as well as playing out through settler colonialist colonized lines. That's what some people call climate or eco-apartheid. In this context of the escalating climate and environmental crisis, Israel presents itself as the champion of green technologies, water desalination technologies, renewable energy projects in Israel. And this is in a way greenwashing of its settler, colonial and apartheid regime. Mekorot, Israel's national water company and a major player in water desalination projects in Israel and beyond, including in the global south, end up not only greenwashing Israel colonialism, but also the proceeds it gets from those projects it implements outside Israel go into the implementation of water apartheid infrastructures on Palestinians. This is what some of us call green colonialism, which is the weaponization and instrumentalization of environmentalism to pursue a deeply racist and violent colonial enterprise. There are direct projects like this in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also in the Golan Heights, where wind farms are being built at the expense of local populations and undermining their sovereignty. There is now, I'll finish by the argument on eco-normalization, normalization in the field of renewable energy and environmental policies. A friend of mine, Manal Shqair, wrote a wonderful chapter in a book I co-edited titled Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region. Sorry, a bit of shameless self-promotion there. But she wrote a wonderful chapter on the question of normalization, where she highlights some important projects, including prosperity project between Jordan and Israel with Emirati involvement. Basically, that project entails Jordan selling its renewable energy, solar energy to Israel, where getting desalinated water from Israel. So Manal argues that Jordan will remain hostage to imports of natural gas, particularly from Israel, while it exports its own green energy in order to receive desalinated water from Israel that plundered and depleted Jordan waters in the first place. So we have Israeli companies like ENLT, NewMed, energy companies, also involved in renewable projects in the Arab world and beyond, especially after the normalization deals, what is called the Abraham Accords, with Morocco, Sudan, Emirates, and who else? There is a fourth country I'm missing. So those projects, those normalization deals, basically their purpose is to integrate Israel into the Arab region economic and energy spheres in a dominant positions, creating new dependencies that strengthen the normalization agenda and posit Israel as an indispensable partner. And with the exacerbating climate and energy crisis, countries reliant on Israel's energy and water, as well as technology, may start to see the Palestinian struggle as a matter of lesser importance than their energy and water security. So, just to summarize, there is clearly an abiding connection between Israeli greenwashing that is reinforced through eco-normalization deals, either in the Arab regions or beyond, and the consolidation of apartheid and settler colonial in Palestine and the Golan Heights. And while Israel is trying to put itself on the map as becoming an important energy hub, and we saw at the first weeks of the genocide how it gave licenses for multiple fossil fuel companies, Western and Israeli, to explore for gas in the East Mediterranean. That points to two. Israel wants to integrate itself fully into the global energy markets and is also playing a role in consolidating global fossil capitalism that is the major cause of the climate crisis. To conclude, for I think it's gloom and doom, but there is always hope. And we are seeing it in here. Things that we need to bear in mind. It is important to incorporate Palestinian liberation within the framework of environmental and climate justice. There will be no climate or environmental justice on all colonized land, from Palestine and beyond. We need to work to end normalization ties with Israel, including in the renewable energy sector and the green technologies. And in this, BDS matters a lot. And we need to continue being inspired by the heroic struggle and resistance of Palestinians that resist, survive, and insist in staying in their own land and controlling their resources. Some people call that sumud, eco-sumud, and steadfastness. I will finish just by one quote from my favorite eco-Marxist, who is Andreas Malms, where he says, "What can the climate front learn from Palestinian resistance? It's that even when the catastrophe is consummated, all pervasive, omnipresent, and unrelenting, we keep resisting. Even when it's too late, when everything has been lost, when the land has been destroyed, we rise out of the rubble and fight back. We do not yield, we do not surrender, we do not give up, because Palestinians do not die. Palestinians will never be defeated. A strong army loses if it doesn't win, but a weak resistance army wins if it doesn't lose. I hope that the ongoing war in Gaza will end with the resistance intact, and that would be a victory. The continuation of the Palestinian resistance in itself would be a victory, because we're going to continue fighting no matter the catastrophes you pour on us. This is source of inspiration for the climate front. In this respect, the Palestinians do not only fight for themselves, they fight for humanity as a whole, for the idea of a humanity that resists catastrophe in whatever shape or form, and which keeps going despite overwhelmingly superior forces on the other side. I think there are all sorts of reasons to stand in solidarity with Palestine resistance for their own sake, but also for our own sake. Thank you.